The Cultural Web is based on the work of Kevin Scholes and Jerry Johnson and first appeared in 1992. It is a useful tool to explore the culture of organizations because culture is a very ethereal thing. It's very difficult to pinpoint what culture actually means, and the Cultural Web is a really useful tool for this. Before we use the Cultural Web, we need to unpick this term culture. And culture is a bit like an onion. There are many layers to a culture. It starts with values, beliefs, behaviors, and also the taken for granted assumptions. So here's a bit more detail about the four layers of culture. The values are often written down. They may be encapsulated in your mission statement, your purpose statement, or your objectives. However, in a lot of cases, these values are sometimes a little bit vague. For example, service to the community. The beliefs and the behaviors are a little bit more specific. With beliefs, these are usually overt, they're talked about. We believe in education for all. We believe in being a fair trade organisation. And the behaviors are the day-to-day ways in which the organization operates. I guess how we do work around here. And these are a little bit about the work routines, the hard things, but also the soft issues as well. The hardest thing to describe is often the paradigm, those taken for granted assumptions. And this is the real core of culture. It's difficult to identify, it's difficult to explain, it's a bit ethereal. And it's often, the kind of gut feel you get about working in an organization or working within a school. The Cultural Web is a useful tool which allows us to unpick this central core of culture, the paradigm, the take for granted assumptions. I'm going to look at each part of the Cultural Web in a little more detail. When we look at the Cultural Web, I would like you to spend a little bit of time reflecting on your school. As we go through each of the petals on this diagram, think about what does it mean for your school, your culture? The first aspect are the stories or the core beliefs. What are the past events that are talked about? Who are the people who are part of those stories? What does it say about your school, the quality of learning and teaching, the research? What are the stories that people get told when they join your school? Who are the heroes, the villains, and the mavericks? Next, take a walk around your school and notice the symbols that you see. These are the visual representation of your school. It may include how big the offices are, what's the formal or informal dress code, what kind of signs do people have on their door, are there any status symbols, and what image do these symbols give out? Next, think about the power structures. These are the pockets of real power in your school. This may involve one or two key academics, or maybe the whole senior leadership team, or maybe the whole school. The key is that these people have the great amount of influence on the decisions, the operations, and the strategic direction your school will take. So who has the real power in your school? And how is that power used? Next are the routines and rituals. This is the daily behavior and actions of people who work in your school. This determines what's expected to happen, how people are expected to behave, what's celebrated, what's valued. So what do these routines and rituals say about your school? The control systems is all about the hard measures and the soft measures, the KPIs, the metrics, the appraisal, the feedback, and how the data obtained from these measures are used across the school. It looks at financial systems, quality systems, and rewards. What do the control systems say about your school? Finally, it's the organizational structures. This includes both the structures as defined by any kind of organizational chart, but also the unwritten lines of power and influence that indicate whose contributions are most valid. Is your structure flat or hierarchical? What are the formal and informal lines of authority? Just take a moment and think about the recent Actual Learning sets. We've been talking about the shadow of the former head of school. We've been talking about how to change the structure from a flat structure to a more hierarchical one. And this is where the Cultural Web will really help to start to think about that in a little bit more detail, to identify what you need to do to change that culture. Here's an example. is the cultural web of the NHS, which can be found in the Exploring Corporate Strategy book by Scholes and Johnson. It explores the paradigm, the symbols, the power, the organisational structures, the controls, the routines and rituals, and the stories that are prevalent throughout the NHS. You may want to spend a little bit of time looking at the cultural web for your school. What does this say about your school and the current paradigm? So we now come to the so what moment. You may have looked at your cultural web. You may have identified and codified your culture. But what does this mean? How do we use this to develop strategy and to instigate change? This is what the next part of this presentation is about. When thinking about strategic development, you can use the cultural web to map your culture as it is now, and also to think about what culture you need in the future. When considering strategic change and transformational change, start by looking at each element of the cultural web. Ask yourselves questions that will help you determine the current paradigm. What are the dominant factors in each area? Once you've created this picture, repeat the exercise, but this time think about the culture that you want. Start from your school's strategy. Think about how you want your school's culture to look if everything were to be correctly aligned. The next stage is to compare and contrast the two maps. Which aspects of the current culture will support the strategy development? Which aspects of the culture will block it? What are the new aspects of the culture that are needed? This is where the power of the cultural web comes into its own. It helps you really think about what kind of culture you want to build for the future. You can capture all this in a 2x3 grid. What aspects of the culture do you want to keep? What do you want to block? What do you need to add? And how are you going to do this? How are you going to keep those parts of the culture that are really precious? How are you going to block those parts of the culture that will really detract against the strategy? And how will you add new aspects of the culture that will help you move forward? When we next meet online, I'll be asking you to think about this 3x2 grid. What is it about your culture that you must keep? What must you block? What must you add? And how are you going to do that? It's really important that we start to think about the culture of our schools, of our organisations, and how that may facilitate strategic development or impede it. I guess the best way to sum up this short presentation is to talk about the quote from Peter Drucker. And that quote is, "Culture has strategy for breakfast." So we may have the greatest strategy, the greatest strategic plan, but sometimes it's really difficult to implement it because the culture will not allow it. And that's why the cultural web is such an important tool.